Okay, I'd like to welcome you this morning to the inaugural workshop of the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub. I'm so glad so many of you could come. It's great to see you here. I'd like to give a special thanks to Elsevier for providing generous support for this workshop. We're hoping today to give you time to network with your colleagues, to form collaborations, and of course we will have a lot of time during the breakout sessions to plan for the day. We do have lunches provided so that people don't have to go out and get lunch. You'll take those and move to your breakout session, and we also have a reception planned at the end of the day for additional time to talk, so I hope you'll stay and join us for that. On the slide, you can see the logo for the Northeast Hub, and it gives you an idea of the structure. Around the edges are spokes, which correspond to the challenges for the region, and these were challenges that were identified at the time of the proposal. We are looking forward to adding more spokes as time goes on, and we have connectors, which are cross-cutting themes which apply across all applications. So here I am. This is the face behind all of the email that you have been receiving for the last month, and you'll be hearing from me again. And as I said, I'm so glad I'm going to be getting to meet all of you today. In addition to leading the Northeast Big Data Hub, I'm also director of Columbia's Data Science Institute and a professor in the computer science department. With the explosion of data across all disciplines, we're seeing a transformation in how people work today. Big data is changing how research is done in academic disciplines. No longer do scientists use, or there has been a long tradition of scientists using hypothesis-driven methods. And in contrast with big data, they can use data analysis to propose multiple solutions and to see which one that there's more evidence for. Big data is also having a big impact on societal challenges. In medicine, for example, we're seeing a change in how much data about patients and their genomes is changing how diagnosis and treatment is done. Big data is also disrupting business models. It's changing how companies do marketing and investment in companies, among many other problems. So NSF has set up a national network of big data innovation hubs to help us look at some of these problems. They'd like to see the hubs impact societal problems through analysis of large data sets. Through the hubs, we're hoping to form consortia of academic, industry, government, and nonprofit institutions, and to really bring people together across these different sectors to begin to share data and approaches to the problem. Through the hub, we plan to establish partnerships to bring people together for specific projects where we can accelerate progress in the big data space. So NSF has formed 4 hubs across the US, the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, and the South. Of the 4 hubs, we are the smallest geographically, but we have the same population as the other hubs. The division was based on census data. And so the fact that we're the most densely populated leads to some of the unique characteristics and the kinds of challenges that we'll be looking at. At the time of the proposal, we had close to 200 people involved and almost 100 institutions. And the hub will be growing. We're open to all of you should consider joining if you haven't already, and we're interested in adding institutions. So given the unique characteristics of the Northeast Hub, I'll give you just a few examples of some of the challenges that we're looking at. In the Northeast, we have 3 of the 10 largest cities in the US, and thus it's natural that we should look at how we can use data to help improve our lives in cities. In the Northeast, we have 4 of the top 10 hospitals of the nation, and thus health will be one of the focuses that we'll be looking at. In the Northeast, we have a dense concentration of academic institutions and the Ivy Leagues, and thus one of our spokes will be looking at how we can use big data to advance progress in science. Today, we'll be hearing about some challenges for us in the big data space. We'll be hearing from industry to get an idea of what their concerns are and how we might better connect with them. We'll be hearing in a government session towards the end of the day about national funding priorities, as well as some proposed initiatives in the area of smart cities. And a major part of what we'll be doing today are the breakout sessions. These will be led by the leaders of each of the spokes and the connectors, who I'm calling the task leads. And the goal in these breakout sessions will be to plan which challenges you look at and how you will accomplish making progress in these areas over the course of the grant. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew McCallum, who is going to introduce our opening keynote speaker. Andrew is a professor in the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass Amherst. He is a member of the executive committee and so has been closely involved with this so far. And he's a director of the Center for Data Science at Amherst. Andrew.
Thank you very much. So data science and its ability to gather, share, and analyze data makes our national defense both more efficient and more effective. It also raises a lot of privacy concerns. And Leiter, our next speaker, has served in many capacities with insight and probing questions on both sides of these considerations. He's currently the executive vice president for business development at Leidos Holdings, a Fortune 500 company. That focuses on science and technology for national defense. He was previously the director of the National Counterterrorism Center from 2007 to 2011, having been appointed by George W. Bush and then asked to stay by Barack Obama. In this role, he oversaw U.S. counterterrorism and intelligence and government-wide counterterrorism strategic planning and was intimately involved in the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. He previously served as an assistant United States attorney and law clerk to Justice Stephen Breyer, and prior to that, flew warplanes for the U.S. Navy in combat in both Iraq and the former Yugoslavia. He continues to serve as an advisor to the NTC and serves on advisory groups for the American Law Institute on Information and Privacy and the Aspen Institute on Homeland Security. He received his JD from Harvard and his BA right here at Columbia. Join me in welcoming Michael Leiter.
Thank you. Good morning. So I have 2 caveats before I say anything. First of all, I am putting this out not to check my email, but just to make sure I'm on time. But then my 2 caveats. First of all, I did go to Columbia, but I am the absolutely wrong person to be here. When I was at Columbia, I was a history major at the college. I never made it past the gym to this end of the campus at all. So it is truly bizarre for me to be speaking here. Second, if I blabber on at some point completely incoherently, please do not attribute it to my core abilities, but rather that I just took the red eye from San Diego, and truthfully, I felt better. But what I'd like to talk about today is how I've seen big data evolve, how the world has evolved with big data, and how all of that has started to affect national security. Now, this is obviously an enormous topic in political race today, normally with very little insight or actual knowledge or facts, but it is a constant issue, and I think from my perspective, big data and national security, those two phrases or words will be tied together indelibly into the future. So I'm not going to, as a history major, try to define big data for this audience, but I at least want to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about as big data, since one person's big data is another person's small data. I remember way back when I was in the Navy at some point, the Navy thought big data was PowerPoint presentations, and it limited the size of presentations that you could send because it was taking out the network. So this is sort of funny now, but in truth, again, depending on what your context is, one person's big is another person's tiny. So I'll at least give you a sense of how in national security, not that more than 2 petabytes is big and under 2 petabytes is small, but a sense of how we're thinking about it. And pretty standard stuff here. You, of course, have the 3 V's, volume, velocity, and variety. Rather self-explanatory. Whoops. Let's try that again. And again, another fairly standard definition from the National Science Foundation. I'm thinking of this as many sources, any type, structured, unstructured, semi-structured. The scale on both sides and the speed make it difficult to process and analyze. Now again, what does that mean in the national security community? If you're sitting at NSA, your big data is probably pretty big data for all of you. If you are an analyst, say, at the FBI, your big data is actually remarkably small to those people at FBI. So the lack of a consistent definition, not that we have to have one, but in each of these contexts, these challenges are very different depending on one's perspective. So if I'm talking about big data and national security, I'm sorry, I move around a lot and I'm doing these. It's partially because I'm from New Jersey. It's partially just that if you're a counterterrorism guy, being a moving target is a good thing. This is a remarkably small stage for that, but I'll try. If this is about national security and big data, of course, what am I talking about in national security? Because that can be pretty all-encompassing in today's world. But to start, basic defense. What does the Department of Defense care about? It's foreign enemies, getting attacked by near-peer competitors, challenging those. That's certainly national security in my book, pretty core, and I think core to most. And the piece, obviously, that since 9/11, where this has evolved much more, is homeland security. If you had talked to someone in the US government 15 years ago and say, hey, those folks over at the US Customs Service, do they do national security? All the people at CIA and the Department of Defense would say, oh gosh, no, they're just border guards. And clearly today, when we think of national security broadly, homeland security is a big part of that, so that border is also part of this discussion. The intelligence community. I'm going to do my very best not to use any acronyms today I don't otherwise explain. But the intelligence community, the CIA, the FBI, if I have to explain those, just go outside and read a book. The Department of Homeland Security, the Defense Intelligence Agency, all these organizations that are within other elements of the US government whose job it is to collect information out in the world, either clandestinely or openly, and then analyze that to support decision makers. Counterterrorism, clearly a part of national security. Cybersecurity, again, something if we talked about 10 years ago, the idea that there really was no discussion of cybersecurity, but today, I think easily ranked in one of the top 2 or 3 issues that national security people talk about, cybersecurity. So, and finally, law enforcement. And why do I put law enforcement there? Well, because law enforcement ends up touching all of these things in many ways. And whether it's a situation, the hoax we saw yesterday in Los Angeles and New York about the schools, or San Bernardino, law enforcement is actually an integral part today of many of these national security challenges. Again, a complete change in rubrics from 15 years ago, where the idea that the NYPD officer outside might have some responsibility for broader national security issues would be almost laughable. But once you start to include this, of course, you are potentially talking about vastly different data sources, different privacy issues. And once again, if we go to the NSA example of NSA in the intelligence world, big data, that's awfully different from what big data means to the law enforcement community today. So, where were we on 9/11? I'm a history major again, so I have to do just a bit of history, but I think history is really important to understand how we ended up where we are today and the challenges we face. So, small data is a challenge. Now, this is not actually a pile of FBI files, but it might as well have been. The FBI was infamous pre-9/11 for fundamentally having a limited, if any, electronic system for sharing its data. You had an office in New York, you had a New York City field office, you had an office in New Jersey. Did they ever talk to each other? Well, if they did, it was only by phone and fax. It was very difficult for an agent in New York to actually be able to do any sort of coordination. So even small amounts of data were actually enormously challenging. On 9/11, we get this very, very famous, what I think is now potentially one of the most misleading phrases which has come into national security and big data. What was the failure for the US government on 9/11? They do talk about a failure of imagination, but then they talk about a failure to connect the dots. And why does that bother me? Because it sounds so simple, right? You forgot to, everyone remembers those drawings we had as kids, 1 to 2 to 3, and if you just do that, then of course you see bin Laden like about to strike. Well, that's wonderful if you just have those dots and people know how to connect them. And of course, you don't have dots. What you have is a mass of information and noise, and then you have to figure out which dots are relevant. And you could connect those dots in any one of countless ways and get different pictures. So you could get bin Laden about to strike, or you could get Han Solo pointing towards the Millennium Falcon if you looked at data in different ways. And there are great studies on this, the challenges of connecting dots. Really the most seminal written post-World War II about the experience of Pearl Harbor. And many of these challenges hadn't actually changed. But again, this idea of connecting the dots, we have to have this data and we have to draw those connections so we know what that picture looks like. And as I've already mentioned a little bit, there was really no consolidation or correlation between disparate data sets. So the picture of these two individuals, these were two of the hijackers on 9/11. They're sort of best well known, and they show both the lack of consolidation of data sets and the lack of correlation of data sets. And let's face it, in 2001, if you weren't consolidating data sets, the idea that you were going to have disparate data correlated was pretty slim, so just the consolidation was a challenge. But these two individuals were known very well by the CIA. They had met in Malaysia with al-Qaeda operatives. Then they came to the United States, were living in San Diego, living in the same building as another FBI source was living. The FBI had no idea. Why did the FBI not know? Because the CIA had one data set which involved people who were known or suspected terrorists. The FBI had another. Certainly they were not put in the same place. So when you type in Khalid al-Mihdhar, you might see it in both. And there was no ability whatsoever, even if they were in two different data sets, to actually correlate that and say, hey, by the way, CIA analysts or FBI agents, you should be concerned because someone the CIA is worried about these two people are now in San Diego. So these were some of the most basic challenges. Now, if you want more, there are the 600 pages of the 9/11 report to study, but at its most basic, this is what we faced on 9/11. So how do we solve this? Largely in a typically government way. What's the first thing you do? You create something new. You create a new organization. And this was my organization, the National Counterterrorism Center. Well-intentioned, and I think, truthfully, one of the more effective tools that was created in 9/11. And what was it? Well, if we have an FBI over here and a CIA over here, let's create one National Counterterrorism Center where everyone sits together in the same building, and all of that data gets in the same place. Not an unreasonable way to try. By the way, what you can't see, this was our watch floor. Each one of these watch officers had what? They had between 8 and 15 pizza boxes. And they would bounce between the CIA network and the FBI network and the DHS network, and they'd push the button. And everyone in here who knows data science knows that that's not the best way to correlate large sets of disparate data. But it's better than nothing. At least you have a human brain who can look at that disparate data and try to combine them. So that was solution one. Solution two, lots of talk about this, especially after San Bernardino. You create a watch list. This is the best way to illustrate it. I promise you it's not in manila folders anymore. But there is, in fact, a database at the prior organization I showed you. It's called the Terrorist Identities Data Mart Environment, affectionately known as TIDE, which includes a single database of all known and suspected terrorists. And we can have a long talk. I'm happy to in the questions about how you get on that list, how you get off that list, all these things. But the idea was no matter who had the information, you'd put that in one simple database that anyone with a proper clearance could access. Makes sense. Last but not least, you have the place where this can occur. Right? You have the National Counterterrorism Center. You have a database with all the terrorist information in it. Then you actually have to get it out to people, of course, because it doesn't do you any good if the police officer here pulls you over and, Kathy, I'm sorry, I need someone. I'm going to make you into a terrorist today. Kathy Mckeown has been dealing with bin Laden for a long time. She gets pulled over in New York with some odd things in her car. You'd like the police officer, of course, to type her name in when she checks her license and say, that's odd. What's Kathy doing with all this? Maybe I ought to tell the FBI about Kathy and her bottled gas in the back of her taxi cab. How do you do that? Well, that's pretty complicated. Why? Because the NYPD officer, of course, go back to that last slide where I had law enforcement down here and intelligence way up here. The NYPD can't just log in and see all the data from the National Security Agency about Russia and China and very sensitive interception of data. That would be a real challenge. So you have to create the system once you have the data to actually make sure that that data is shared and accessible in a meaningful way. So that's what this rather complicated chart shows, but all that really, really classified information that starts in here from Washington and all over the globe slowly gets filtered. So it may not say that we know due to an interception with bin Laden that Kathy is the sleeper cell in New York for that New York City cop. But when the New York City cop types in Kathy's name, it will say, call the FBI. She's on a watch list. And then they'll call up and they'll call the FBI, and the FBI will call these guys and they'll say, whoa, we have to go send somebody to talk to Kathy. Thank you very much, police officer. Mahoney? Whatever we want to call him. Statistically, it's still probably Mahoney. Call him up and say, yes, thanks very much, great work. Here's a medal. We'll go take care of Kathy now. So you have the organization, you have the database, and then you have a system for sharing this information across a wide range of stakeholders. And that actually works today, whether it's a police officer, whether it's someone issuing a visa overseas in an embassy, or it's a Customs and Border Protection officer at the border. You don't know it, but that is instantly being checked, usually using biographic information, but increasingly using biometric information against a consolidated database. And that is starting to get to, especially when we talk about biometrics, big-ish, if not really big data. All right, so that was good. It probably helped us a lot by about 2002. The challenge that we, of course, have is it turns out that the world hasn't stayed the same. So very quickly, how are some of the ways the world's changed? People know this. That's why you have this initiative. I mean, 2001 was easy, folks. Everyone is producing data, and the volumes of data are just tremendous, of course, in those 14 years. On the cybersecurity front, this is particularly problematic. It's not just that there's more of it. It's that increasingly to individuals, it's much more sensitive. Right? At the beginning, I'm just sending an email, maybe not doing much. Now I've got pictures of all my kids and all my bank account records, and I'm accessing from my mobile device. So the sensitivity of some of this data is getting increasingly significant. The democratization of communities. So once again, it used to be, who is going to talk via satellite phone, encrypted satellite phone? I mean, that's like special forces stuff. Today, you can probably go buy one for $250 at Best Buy and have all the communications in encrypted ways that you want, either via telephonically or certainly via apps. So it's not just that there's more data, it's not just that it's more sensitive, but people can communicate fundamentally any way they want, and what used to be very, very high-end is now readily accessible, and there's actually less at the higher end to talk about. And while all this communications has happened, when we joke about, now I can actually do it, we joke about bin Laden sitting there and plotting and planning. Of course, we now live in a world, at least from a terrorism perspective, where that hierarchical organization has been completely changed. And there's very little hierarchy at all. It's much more of a network movement, in part because, I would argue, because of those three prior notes. So it isn't just that you have to watch for what bin Laden's doing. It's that you have a ubiquity of people who might be radicalized and pose some sort of quote-unquote national security threat. So the movement itself, what you're trying to defend against, has continued to evolve. And last but not least, probably no one here has heard of him, but there was a guy named Edward Snowden a couple of years ago. The level of trust, we always used to joke, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Boy, that really wasn't very funny 2, 3, 4 years ago or even today. Right? The level of trust between those who are supposed to be protecting and those that they are protecting has completely broken down. And I think Snowden was simply accelerated that, worsened it, and highlighted it to some extent. I don't attribute it all to him. Really, I think since 9/11, we've had a breakdown in public trust of lots of institutions, whether it's Congress. It's not just the people who are in the security community, but certainly those in the security community have felt that most acutely. So that's a troubling set of a combination of issues, I would argue. So let's get a little bit more granular about that. Then we have Paris. And truthfully, I don't think in the, how many Europeans do we have here? Okay, you're going to have to leave now too? No. I don't know if you've been back recently or anyone else has been here in Europe, and if you happen to be talking to security officials in Europe, I don't think most Americans fully appreciate the degree to which Paris has completely changed the perspective of security in Europe. In fact, much more so than San Bernardino here in the United States. What has been built in the EU and the security structures around the EU and the Schengen Initiative for travel, I'm not going to say it's dead, but it is on real life support right now in Europe because of what happened in Paris. So this is going to be this is kind of an 8.0 earthquake. So we all know what happened, but let's talk about some of the reasons why. Well, it turns out that you have France, and you have Belgium, and you have Germany, and you have Italy, and last I checked, data didn't care about that at all. The data, of course, I mean, this is duh, of course, data moves seamlessly across these borders. Think about that as I move on to security organizations haven't. So we in the US had a bit of this problem, of course. We had the FBI and DHS, but we didn't have the same problem in terms of New Jersey and New York. Well, as Europe and the world has moved forward in terms of the seamlessness of all of this for data, the security organizations have not kept up at all. The security organizations still live in their bordered world. You can imagine this starts to be a huge challenge. Moreover, not only is it borderless for data, this area, you can't quite see the differentiation in color, but this darker green area, of course, is borderless for travelers as well. So you now have a Europe where no borders if you're traveling, no borders if you're communicating, but very strict borders if you're trying to do security. That's a very difficult combination. And of course, it undermines your ability to take advantage of that wealth of data to some extent if you are limited within your own state's authorities. What else? I don't want to dwell on this too much because I think it's still difficult to know exactly how much tactically this applied, either in San Bernardino or Paris. I think that takes some time to understand. But the basic strategic point is undoubtedly true in Paris. I don't know yet on San Bernardino. Encryption, and I don't mean to beat up on WhatsApp. I could have put lots of logos up there. It's just the best known one. So apologies to the WhatsApp crowd. Encryption makes this very, very hard. And I think the discussion about encryption, again, I tend to put it on the side of not so well informed yet in much of Washington. There are no easy answers in my book. But we have to at least accept that the widespread availability of encryption makes some of the things that law enforcement and national security types have done for a long time more difficult. Perhaps not impossible, but more difficult, at least in the interim until you address the solution or find a solution. And then finally, what else really contributed to Paris? So you have two sorts of volume here. This is in Romania, the train station. So you have the people volume. You have security services, and this is really relevant in the big data world, that are still relatively small, about the same size they were in 2000 or so. Now looking at a population which is just exploding, and it's a vulnerable population. And that is very hard. There's a core volume problem. And of course, you have this volume problem, which is, again, a little hard to see, but this is, of course, the volume of the internet. This is in 1994, 2004, 2014. So if you now have more and more people producing more and more data, some of that data is more and more difficult for security officials to see, and that's borderless data, and you are limited to a certain world, you can start to see the nervousness and the challenges posed by big data in this national security context. But, of course, it's not just Paris. Let's think about how something like Syria affects the world. Who here is depressed now? Good. I usually can get at least 50% of the crowd wanting to leave by 9:30. So let's talk more broadly about Syria and how big data is influenced or should be seen vis-a-vis Syria. And I use Syria not just because it's right now the home of ISIS, but truthfully, in national security circles, Syria is problematic in not innumerable, really big ways. Whether, of course, it is ISIS, whether it's the breakdown of borders throughout the region, whether it's the unmitigated slaughter of innocents, the refugee crisis. I mean, if we look around the world, there are lots of trouble spots in the world. Syria is not where you want to buy vacation property anytime soon. And social media is clearly central to that movement. And social media is, at its root, a big data challenge. It's a wonderful thing in many ways, but it's also a big data challenge. Again, all of these are just examples, so Facebook and Twitter, I'm sorry. I've already touched on this, but communications are remarkably secure today in a way that even 5 years ago was not nearly the case. We used to look at communications, whether it's from Yemen or Pakistan or even domestically, and the availability and ease of using encryption, which was top-shelf encryption, which made it hard for the government to understand what was going on, has really changed dramatically in the past 4 or 5 years. This is one of my favorite charts. Again, this is a snapshot of 25,000 flights simultaneously from a satellite. So you see, we're not traveling all over the globe all the time, but there's a whole lot of travel at any one time. And we all know this, but the degree of travel today is just incredible. So again, borderless society in many ways, bordered society in other security ways, you can have a really bad mismatch. So now, big data, I don't want to think of big data as just a problem. Right? Big data, of course, is a huge opportunity, too. It didn't used to be that the bad guys, when we had the Cold War, that we would hop on Facebook and know what the Soviet Union was thinking. Well, this isn't all bad. Although I wonder what Facebook would, how long would the Soviet Union have lasted if it had Facebook, right? The KGB would have loved it, too. So let's think about how can we also use big data, because it can be really, really powerful tool in addressing some of these national security issues. But why isn't it as perfect as we would like? First of all, it's just really hard to find what you care about when the volume is this high. And that may not matter that much if you're targeting advertisements. Right? If you're just, I want a 70% chance that Kathy really does want to know when the specials at the Metropolitan Opera are on, I send her that and it turns out she hates opera. Okay, not the best advertising, but not a big deal. I start to target someone and I affect their civil liberties because I've made that 70% judgment based on big data, we may have a whole different ballgame. So the degree of precision and accuracy which is required in these national security circles is often very different from what you might require in other big data situations. And I'll come back to that, but does anyone actually think that data analytics as applied to big data are perfect yet? This room knows that it's not. Truthfully, you go up to Congress and you testify on this, and they'll say, but Google knows that. Okay, that's not quite the answer we need yet. And then there are huge political issues around all of this. Really legitimate concerns about privacy. When I talk about national security, I never want to diminish that. The extreme distrust that I talked about. And this last one is really important. As quickly as technology moves, you sort of have the inverse problem with law. Law, of course, moves very, very slowly. So now try to explain to a judge how the interweb works and how you're going to target or not target and what you're going to take out. It's very, very difficult to keep law up with technology as it evolves. And that means you often have a mismatch. And yes, I know I said the interweb. I said that on purpose. Just no one got the joke. And finally, you have some real practical limitations. Even if you actually know exactly what you need to do, you have the perfect tool for it, you're going to apply it, you're going to have a legal construct which allows you to do it, well, can the government actually buy it in time and apply it to a massive enterprise and train people and use it? Or by the time they do that, is it 6 years later and 5 new tools have come out? This isn't just deleting one app on your iPhone and then downloading the newer, better one. This is really complicated in huge institutions. And this highlights itself in so many ways today. We have global technology. No one here who deals with big data in the commercial sense ever thinks of a US customer. It is a global industry, but we have national laws. So, how is some of this working today? And I put this in because there's been so much bunk about the watch list after San Bernardino. As I already noted, we actually do have one watch list. Many people can access it. And I say, and even more confusion, because outside of the people who actually do it, no one understands it. I did my best to educate some candidates several weeks ago. When they started talking about it, I failed miserably. I'm sorry, America. The good news is we're actually leveraging medium-sized data, not really big, but medium-sized data to consolidate it, share it, and affect it. Does that mean that there aren't mistakes in that data? Of course not. But it works better. So the other way in which big data is being used is, let's go back. I'll use myself as an example. Kathy, you've been a great terrorist. Thank you very much. Now Mike Leiter is the terrorist. And I check in, and I know I've been using my name, so I don't want to use my name when I check in with the airline. I get a really nice false passport, and I come in and I say, no, it's not Mike Leiter, it's Michael Bond. Right? That's just, I don't know why. It's Michael Bond, and they look at it and they say, very good to see you, Mr. Bond. Please go ahead to first class. Well, if we were just using names, then these sorts of things are easy. But of course, big data can help us understand that Michael Bond might have a lot of similarities with Michael Leiter. And again, big data can provide some of those correlations. Now, it might not be, those correlations might not be enough to send a drone strike out to kill Michael Bond. But to make sure that Michael Bond isn't carrying something onto his airplane, or whether he should get a visa, or whether he should be a refugee, there are lots of interesting things you can do. I'm not going to go into huge detail on that, but imagine if it turned out that Michael Bond and Michael Leiter had called a lot of the same people and gone on a lot of the same travel previously and visited a lot of the same websites. You start to see some correlations, and you might then do some more digging into who Michael Bond really is. So screening is not just this basic Michael Leiter, yes, check in, or go, don't go. You can, of course, when you know some information about the person, use big data to correlate things and identify an individual in much deeper ways. And security and commerce, technology and big data are being used. As I said, I just got back from San Diego and a Mexican port yesterday, and the degree to which technology is being used now in Mexico to screen every container which is going in and out of Mexico, correlating that with previous inspections, correlating that with other data, is really impressive and truthfully much better than what we do here in the United States. So there are ways in which you can use big data quite well. Then, of course, you have this talk. Who here has testified in front of Congress? I'm going to give you exactly how it feels right now. Mr. Leiter, I don't understand. You say this is so hard, but why don't you just use an algorithm? I often, for those of you who know the movie Princess Bride, I love the line, I do not think that word means what you think it means. I hope this crowd knows what an algorithm is. An algorithm is not some magical piece you just feed in and there's your answer. It turns out that knowing what algorithm to apply for what situation and what data, these are really hard, big issues. And I was the junior dumb history major member of this National Academy study on signals intelligence that came out of the Snowden disclosures. And the question was, rather than collecting bulk data, are there ways to avoid that? Don't collect the data. Let's use software in some alternative way. So the first question is, well, use an algorithm. And again, a very distinguished group from across industry and academia, one little excerpt there. What did we say? Automatic analysis seems unlikely to replace human analysis, although it may be useful as an augmentation of what humans do. In the future, we may get there, but in the national security realm today, you can't just hit a button and have some magical algorithm go out and capture exactly the information you will need in the future, pull it back and give you an answer. That's Jason Bourne, not real world. And in fact, you need a human to do much of this. It can be assisted in enormous ways by big data, but it's not so easy. So the other point, well, Mr. Leiter, you're collecting all this data. You're just collecting too much. That's the problem. Just collect what you need. Ha-ha! Thank you, Congressman. I wish I had thought of that. It turns out that puzzles and mysteries are much easier if you know before the fact what you actually need. But of course, other than in Monday Morning Quarterback, you don't know. We go back to connecting the dots. Once I know it's an attack on 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, I can connect those dots and I can just collect that data. Before I know what I'm looking for, it turns out that indeed, there is no software technique that will fully substitute for bulk collection, where it is relied on to answer queries about the past after new targets become known. Now, you can potentially go out and get that data after the fact, and if it exists, but if data is ephemeral, you can't, once you know what you now have to understand better, whether it's a terrorist plot or something else, you can't magically create that. That data has to be somewhere, and it may be required to be collected. I know I'm going a little long. I'm sorry, Kathy. Almost done. So back to that report. If the intelligence community continues to collect signals intelligence in bulk, the report can do other things. So it's not that big data suddenly solves your problems and you punch in the algorithm or you don't have to collect anything anymore, but big data and tools can really help in a lot of ways. Of course, when you have this massive data, which we've already talked about is increasingly sensitive, coming from more and more places, you can use technology and you can use big data, data analytic techniques, of course, to reduce the risk that people look at the wrong thing. And we're not doing enough of that. We should do more. Similarly, it can really help. You can use big data analytics. So the Congress can, in fact, do oversight and say, what are the queries that people are looking at in the intelligence community? They're collecting all this data to use big data to secure X. Are they doing it the right way? And overseers can use those same data analytic techniques to make sure that's occurring. And finally, maybe most valuable in my view, big data analytics can help us understand, if we look at the panoply of issues that are facing us in national security over a month, a year, 5 years, say, what data was actually relevant and mattered? Because right now, truthfully, we have very little idea. You can sort of anecdotally say, phone calls are important or emails important. But on a more granular sense, what is it that we really used and was useful to us? And analyzing that, I think, is incredibly valuable. So what does all of this mean? Another quote. Lots of trends. We're on that way. All of this is going to have an impact on signals intelligence. And in this context, signals intelligence is sort of government speak for data. Anything we think about in big data not collected by a person would fall into the signals intelligence world. And the net effect of this on the future isn't clear. So you had to listen to me for 40 minutes to say, the world's sort of messy. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. But my real punchline is the thinking and the tools that are occurring here will be absolutely central and only more central to these national security issues in the future. There are no trend lines which are not increasing the relevance of how we think about big data, how we analyze big data, how we protect the data that we're analyzing, how we share that. There's nothing which is not going to push us to better need those tools and thinking than we have today. So with that, do we have a few minutes for questions? Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.